August 19th, 1945. 6:12 hours. Grafenwehr training area, Bavaria. The rain comes down in a thin, metallic drizzle, tapping against steel like nervous fingers. A line of tanks sits motionless in the grey dawn olive drab hulks stretching into the fog. Their engines are cold. Their guns are sealed with canvas covers that flutter weakly in the wind. An M4 Sherman stands at the edge of the lot, its tracks half sunk into the mud. The tank smells of oil, wet earth, and old cordite. Somewhere nearby, a crow calls. Once. Then silence again. There is no battle today. No shouted commands. No radio chatter crackling with urgency. No German armor lurking beyond a hedgerow. Just stillness, heavy, unfamiliar. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of what this machine used to be. This Sherman serial number faded. White Star, chipped and scarred, survived Normandy. It crossed France. It burned its way through the Siegfried Line and watched the Reich collapse in slow, violent pieces. Its crew named it Lucky Penny. 2 of those men are dead now. One went home without his left hand. Another is still somewhere in Europe, drinking himself into forgetfulness. And the tank? The tank is waiting to find out what happens to a weapon when the war it was built for is finally over. Victory came suddenly for the Sherman. One day it was clawing forward under fire, its engine screaming at full throttle as armor-piercing rounds cracked against its hull. The next day, 5E Day, it sat idle, gun elevated uselessly toward a sky filled not with flak but celebration. Soldiers climbed onto its turret, laughing, smoking, taking photographs they'd show their children one day. But victory is not the same as purpose. By the summer of 1945, the United States Army possessed more armored vehicles than it knew what to do with. Nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks had been produced during the war, more than any other tank in history. They were everywhere, in fields, in forests, lined up in endless rows across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. And suddenly they were obsolete, not officially, not yet, but quietly, inevitably, because even as the last shots faded, the future was already rolling in on heavier tracks. In Washington, planners stared at maps and spreadsheets, not battlefields. The war economy was shutting down. Factories that once poured out tanks by the hour were being converted back to civilian production. Steel was needed for homes, engines for trucks, money for rebuilding a tired nation. The Sherman, once the backbone of Allied armored power, had become a problem. It was too expensive to ship home in massive numbers, too numerous to keep active, too symbolic to simply destroy at least not all at once, so the decisions came quietly. Some Shermans would be mothballed, some would be scrapped, some would be sold, loaned, or given away, and some no one was quite sure yet. Across Europe, tank parks like Grafenwehr became graveyards in waiting. Crews were ordered to drain fuel, remove sensitive equipment, and walk away. Radios were pulled, machine guns unbolted. The tanks were sealed, catalogued, and left to rust beneath foreign skies. You can almost feel the confusion in those final moments. A sergeant pats the glacis plate one last time. A driver glances back over his shoulder as he walks away, boots squelching in the mud. No farewell ceremony, no salute, just abandonment. But the Sherman did not fade quietly everywhere. In the Pacific, the story took a different turn. On Okinawa, the mud was still stained with blood when Sherman began forming defensive rings around airfields and supply depots. Japanese resistance had collapsed, but no one trusted the silence. Tanks were dug in like pillboxes, their hulls half-buried, guns covering approaches that might never be tested again. When Japan surrendered, these Shermans did roll home. They stayed. The U.S. military looked at the Pacific and saw something new, not victory, but responsibility, occupation, stability, power projection. The Sherman, simple and reliable, was suddenly useful again, not as a breakthrough weapon, but as a symbol, a reminder. Steel does have to move to be threatening. In Japan, Shermans clanked through streets where rubble still smoked. Children stared wide-eyed as American tanks rolled past temples and shattered storefronts. The war was over, but its machines were very much present, and the Sherman learned a new role, not hunter but sentinel. Back in the United States, a different fate awaited thousands more. At depots from California to Alabama, Shermans were stripped down with industrial efficiency. Turrets removed. Engines lifted out. Armor plates cut apart with torches that hissed like angry snakes. Steel that once deflected enemy fire was melted down into rebar. Appliances, car frames. A tank that survived 5 campaigns might end its life as a refrigerator door. There is something unsettling about that transformation. Something final. But not all Shermans were reduced to scrap, because the world was not done fighting. It just hadn't decided where yet. By 1927, a new tension was tightening across the globe. Former allies eyed each other with suspicion. Borders hardened. Ideologies clashed. And suddenly, warehouses full of tanks didn't seem like excess anymore. They seemed like opportunity. The Sherman, cheap, plentiful, proven, became a kind of armored currency. The United States began shipping them to friendly nations by the hundreds, sometimes thousands. France received Shermans to rebuild its armored forces. So did Italy. So did Belgium. In South America, countries like Brazil and Argentina welcomed them eagerly. Even nations that had once fought against the Allies found themselves operating Shermans under new flags, each tank repainted, renumbered, renamed. The Sherman became a citizen of the world. In some armies it was upgraded, new engines, better guns, improved suspension. In others it remained exactly as it had been in 1944. A time capsule of wartime engineering. But everywhere it went, it carried its past with it, and sometimes that past caught up violently with the present. On June 24, 1950, the silence finally shattered. North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel, and the Cold War turned hot in the dust and rice paddies of the Korean peninsula. The U.S. Army, caught off guard, scrambled to respond, and suddenly the Sherman was needed again. Pulled from storage depots in Japan, old M4s were hastily recommissioned. Engines that hadn't turned in years were coaxed back to life. Crews trained on newer tanks found themselves climbing into vehicles their fathers had fought in. You can almost feel the disbelief. This tank again. But war does care about sentiment. In Korea, the Sherman faced a new enemy, the Soviet-built T-24-85. Faster, better armored, armed with a gun that could punch through a Sherman. Hull ranges the old tank could match, and yet once again the Sherman rolled forward, through burning villages, across frozen rivers, up hills slick with ice and blood. It was to the best tank on the battlefield, but it was there. Some Shermans burned in Korea, their thin armor no match for modern anti-tank fire. Others survived long enough to be replaced by Pershings and Pattons. Many were abandoned, wrecked, or cannibalized for parts, and still more Shermans were being shipped elsewhere, to the Middle East, to Asia, to Africa. Everywhere a new nation needed armor fast and cheap, the Sherman appeared. But the world was changing faster than the tank could, and somewhere between the scrapyard, the battlefield, and the museum, the Sherman's final identity was beginning to fracture. Was it a relic, a workhorse, a survivor, or a ghost that refused to die? Because in one desert, under one unfamiliar sun, the Sherman was about to fight one last, shocking war against an enemy that knew exactly how to kill it. And this time, there would be no victory parade waiting at the end. October 29th, 1956, 1647 hours, Sinai Peninsula. The desert wind cuts like a blade, lifting curtains of sand that scrape against steel hulls. Heat shimmers off the ground in violent waves. Somewhere ahead, an explosion thumps low and heavy, felt more than heard. An M4 Sherman crests a shallow rise, its tracks grinding over stone older than civilization itself. The tank wears a new coat of paint, now sand yellow, sun-faded, but beneath it is the same machine that once clawed through Normandy hedgerows. The crew inside is tense, young, too young to remember World War II. Their command appears through the cupola, eyes narrowed, scanning for movement. They know what waits out there. Enemy armor, faster, deadlier, and they know without ever saying it, that their tank is not meant for this fight. This is the Suez Crisis, and the Sherman has no business being here. By the mid-1950s, armored warfare had moved on. Sloped armor, stabilized guns, high-velocity cannons designed to kill at long range. The Sherman, even in its upgraded forms, belonged to another era, but war's dawn to wait for perfect equipment. Israel, newly formed and constantly threatened, had inherited a strange collection of weapons, British, French, American. Among them were Shermans. Old, cheap, available. And so the Israelis did something audacious. They rebuilt the tank. Engines were replaced, suspensions reinforced, armor plates welded on wherever they could fit. Most importantly, new guns were installed, French 75mm cannons, then later even more powerful weapons. The result was something unnatural. A Sherman evolved. They called them M50s and M51s, hybrids of World War II steel and Cold War firepower. On paper, they were still obsolete. In reality, they were dangerous in the hands of crews who knew every bolt, every weakness, every trick. In the Sinai, these upgraded Shermans went to war against Egyptian armor, Soviet-supplied T-34s and Su-100s, old enemies, new battlefield, and somehow, impossibly, the Sherman survived again. But survival came at a cost. In the desert, the Sherman's thin armor showed its age. Hits that would have bounced off newer tanks punched through with brutal ease. Crews relied on speed, coordination, and surprise, not protection. When a Sherman was hit, it burned. Fuel ignited. Ammunition cooked off. Hatches flew open as men scrambled out, some on fire, some screaming, some not moving at all. The nickname from World War II came back with a vengeance. Ronson. Lights first time, lights every time. The difference now was that the crews knew it. They went in anyway, because sometimes being available matters more than being perfect. While the Sherman fought in the Middle East, other tanks were fighting quieter battles elsewhere. In Europe, NATO forces relegated their Shermans to training roles. Recruits learned to drive, load, fire, and repair on machines their grandfathers might have crewed. The tank became a classroom, scarred, dented, endlessly patched. In Asia, Shermans rolled under new flags. India operated them. Pakistan did too. In 1965, during the Indo-Pakistani War, Sherman tanks faced off against newer designs in the dust and heat of the subcontinent. Some were knocked out within minutes. Others held ground stubbornly, using terrain and numbers to compensate for age. Once again, the Sherman refused to simply disappear. But time is undefeated. By the late 1960s, even the most upgraded Shermans were reaching the end of the road. Spare parts became scarce. Armor upgrades reached their limits. Engines strained under the weight of decades of modification. New tanks were arriving. Leopards, Centurions, T-54 and T-55s. Machines designed not just to survive modern war, but to dominate it. The Sherman, for all its resilience, could not compete forever. And so, slowly, almost apologetically, armies began to let it go. Some Shermans were scrapped, finally and unceremoniously, their steel cut apart in shipyards and depots across the world. Others were sold off to private buyers, collectors, or scrapyards. A few were dumped, literally pushed into rivers, lakes, or the sea to clear space. But a strange thing happened during this final drawdown. People started to look at the Sherman differently. In museums, veterans would stop in front of the tank and fall silent. They detrace fingers along weld seams, point out dents, argue about variants, argue about everything, but always with affection and grief, because the Sherman was not just a tank, it was a witness. It had been there when boys became soldiers, when friends burned alive inches away, when victory felt hollow and survival felt undeserved. Museums began restoring Shermans not to fighting condition but to memory. Original paint schemes were painstakingly recreated, unit markings researched, names reapplied to turrets. Fury, Thunderbolt. In the mood, each name a ghost, each tank a tomb that could still move. But not every Sherman found peace behind museum ropes. Some were reborn in stranger ways. In the 1970s and 80s, surplus Shermans found new roles as engineering vehicles, bulldozers, bridge layers, recovery machines. Their turrets were removed, replaced with cranes or plows. The gun that once fired high explosive shells now pushed dirt and debris. There is something poetic about that. A machine built to destroy used to build, to clear roads, to rescue other vehicles, to support, not kill, and yet even then the past clung stubbornly. Old armor scars remained visible beneath fresh paint, a dent from an anti-tank round, shrapnel gouges never fully repaired, silent reminders of a previous life. Meanwhile, in private collections, a different transformation was underway. Wealthy enthusiasts and historians began restoring Shermans to full running condition. Engines roared back to life. Turrets traversed again. Guns demilitarized, but intact, elevated toward the sky. At reenactments, Shermans rumbled across fields, belching smoke, drawing crowds that cheered as if it were 1944 again. But veterans watching felt something else, a tightness in the chest, because for them, the sound of a Sherman engine was not nostalgia. It was survival or death echoing back through time. By the early 1990s, the Sherman's military career was effectively over. A few lingered in reserve units or secondary roles, but the era of the M4 as a fighting tank had finally ended. The world had moved on to composite armor, thermal sights, and missiles that killed from miles away. And yet the Sherman refused to fade quietly, because history has a way of circling back. In 2008, during a construction project in Eastern Europe, workers uncovered something unexpected. Buried beneath decades of soil lay the rusted hull of a Sherman tank. Its turret was still attached. Its gun still pointed forward, frozen in eternal advance. Inside, they found remnants of equipment, personal items, a helmet, a pair of boots. The tank had been abandoned during the final push into Germany, hastily buried when recovery was impossible. It had been waiting to be remembered. The Sherman's legacy is not perfection. It was undergunned, under-armored, often outmatched, and yet it carried the weight of the Allied advance on its steel shoulders. It fought everywhere. It adapted. It endured. It became the most produced tank of World War II, not because it was the best, but because it was good enough, soon enough, often enough. And sometimes that changes history. But the most unsettling truth about the Sherman comes not from its victories or its losses. It comes from the realization that even now, in forgotten corners of the world, some Shermans still exist exactly as they were left, rusting, silent, loaded with stories no one has heard yet. Because one of those tanks hidden for decades under jungle vines and mud would resurface in a way no one expected. And when it did, it would force historians to confront a final, uncomfortable question: what does it really mean for a weapon to survive a war? February 2017, 09:41 hours, Luzon, Philippines. The jungle breathes. Moist air clings to skin and fabric as machetes hack through vines thick as rope. Every step sinks slightly into dark, waterlogged earth. Birds scatter overhead, startled by the sudden intrusion of human noise into a place long left alone. Then someone stops. The guide raises a hand. Silence falls again, unnatural, expectant. Half buried beneath roots and rot, a curved slab of rusted steel emerges from the undergrowth. A white star, barely visible, ghosts through layers of corrosion. It takes a second to understand what you are looking at. Then the shape becomes unmistakable. A Sherman tank. The discovery sends ripples through the historical community. News spreads quickly. Another M4, abandoned during the closing months of World War II, swallowed by jungle and time. It had likely been disabled during the liberation of the Philippines in 1945, left behind as U.S. forces pushed inland. No one knows its crew's names. No one knows if they survived. But the tank remains. Engine seized. Tracks fused with rust. The gun locked forward, aimed at an enemy that never came. It has been waiting for more than 70 years. And suddenly, the Sherman is not history. It is present. This is the strange afterlife of the M4 Sherman. Not a single ending, but hundreds. Some tanks became monuments planted on concrete plinths in town squares, painted bright, guns eternally elevated in triumph. Children climb them. Couples take photos. Few stop to wonder where that tank once fought, or who died inside one just like it. Others became reefs. After the war, navies around the world dumped obsolete armor into the sea. Sherman slid beneath the waves, settling into silence. Coral grew across their hulls. Fish made homes in their turrets. Guns, once meant to kill, now framed schools of drifting. Silver. War machines turned ecosystems. Nature, as always, adapted faster than memory. But memory has a way of resurfacing. Veterans' reunions often included a visit to their tank, if it still existed. Men in their 80s would stand quietly, hands clasped behind their back, staring at steel that had once been the center of their universe. They'd point out details no plaque ever mentioned. That weld wasn't factory. We fixed that after Aiken. That dent, panther round, lucky angle. That scratch there, that was my fault. The Sherman became a shared language, a way to talk about things too heavy to say outright. Fear, loss, survival. Historians, too, began to re-evaluate the tank's reputation. For decades, the Sherman had been criticized, sometimes brutally. Inferior armor, inferior gun. A death trap, some claimed. A symbol of industrial compromise, rather than engineering excellence. But perspective changes with time. Documents emerged, combat reports, production memos, letters from commanders who understood the impossible balance they were trying to strike, build something fast, reliable, transportable, and repairable at scale. The Sherman was never meant to duel tigers head-on. It was meant to be everywhere. And it was. That ubiquity changed wars. A disabled Sherman could often be repaired overnight. Parts were interchangeable. Crews could be trained quickly. Tanks could be shipped across oceans and driven straight into battle. In a war defined by logistics, the Sherman was a logistical miracle. And perhaps that is why it lingers so stubbornly in memory, not because it was glamorous, but because it worked. Yet, for all its legacy, the Sherman also left unanswered questions. What responsibility does a nation have to the machines and men it sends to war? Is preservation honor or sanitization? When a tank is restored, repainted, and polished, does it remember the blood it once carried? Or do we erase that part because it's uncomfortable? You can almost feel that tension when you stand beside a restored Sherman today. The engine growls, powerful and alive. The tracks clatter. The turret turns. But something is missing. The fear. The knowledge that every advance might be your last. In recent years, digital technology has given the Sherman yet another life. Video games, films, virtual reality simulation. Millions now crew Shermans in digital battlefields, experiencing simplified versions of its strengths and weaknesses. The tank has become iconography, recognizable, romanticized, a star, a silhouette, a symbol. But symbols can be dangerous when they replace understanding, because the real Sherman was not pixels or paint. It was cramped, deafening, terrifying. It cooked men alive when it was hit. And still they climbed inside. Somewhere in a warehouse in the American Midwest, a partially restored Sherman sits under fluorescent lights. Its engine is out, its interior stripped. Restoration halted due to lack of funding. On the turret, in faded chalk, someone has written a name, Mary Ann. No records remain of that tank, S-Crew. No photographs, no after-action reports that mention it by name, only the chalk. A human touch reaching across time. This is the Sherman, S-True after-war fate. Not one of retirement but a fragmentation, pieces scattered across continents, across oceans, across memories. Each tank telling a different story. Each story incomplete on its own. But together, they form something larger than steel. They form a question that still has no easy answer. Did the Sherman shape history? Or did history simply need something like it to survive? And if that's true, if wars are won not by perfect weapons, but by sufficient ones, what does that say about the conflicts still waiting in the future? Because somewhere right now another machine is being built with the same logic, Not flawless, just available, just good enough. And one day, long after its war ends, it too will sit silent waiting for someone to ask what became of it. May 7th, 1424, 14 Conan to 3 hours. National Museum of Military History of Virginia. The doors slide open with a low mechanical hum. Cool air replaces the heat outside, carrying the faint smell of oil, old paint, and polished concrete. Footsteps echo as visitors move through the hall slowly, respectfully. Conversations drop to whispers without anyone quite knowing why. At the center of the gallery sits M4 Sherman, restored, immaculate, silent. Its olive drab paint is perfect, almost too perfect. White stars are crisp. The barrel is clean. No soot, no dents, no shrapnel scars. A placard in front lists specifications, production numbers, dates, weight, crew, armament, facts without blood. And yet, you feel it. Something heavy presses down the longer you stand there. Because this tank is not alone. The Sherman is one of the last World War II machines that still exists in such numbers. Dozens remain operational. Hundreds more sit in museums, depots, private collections, and forgotten storage yards across the world. They outlived their war. They outlived many of the men who built them. They even outlived most of the nations they once fought for, as borders shifted and flags changed. Few weapons in history can claim that. Ask a veteran what happened to the Sherman after the war, and you won. Get a neat answer. Some will talk about Korea, some about training grounds, some about scrapyards and torches cutting through armor, but eventually most will say the same thing quietly. It just kept going. The Sherman did not retire with a parade. It did fade into obscurity overnight. It was used up, piece by piece, war by war, decade by decade. It became the physical embodiment of a brutal truth about modern conflict. Wars don't end cleanly. They taper off. They bleed into the next one. And so do the tools. The Sherman, as post-war life, reveals something deeply uncomfortable. It shows that victory does not mean closure. For the men who crewed it, the war followed them home. In dreams. In silence. In habits they could, to explain. The tank remained behind, but the sound of its engine, the smell of hot oil, the claustrophobia of its interior stayed with them forever. For nations, the Sherman became a reminder that preparedness never truly stops, that even after the greatest war in human history, the world immediately began arming for the next. The Cold War did erase the Sherman. It repurposed it. Today, historians debate its legacy endlessly. Was it underpowered? Yes. Was it vulnerable? Absolutely. Was it flawed? In many ways. But it was also decisive, because the Sherman represents a shift in how wars are fought not by singular, invincible machines, but by systems, logistics, production, training, replacement. The Sherman was never meant to be immortal, it was meant to be replaceable. And in that replaceability, it changed warfare forever. Stand close to a Sherman long enough, and you begin to notice details most people miss. The worn edge where hands grabbed the turret to climb aboard. The scuffed floor where boots shifted during sudden stops. The cramped spacing that forced 4 or 5 men into a metal box barely larger than a modern SUV. You try to imagine hours inside it. Days, weeks, then combat, the noise, the heat, the knowledge that your armor might not save you, and still they went forward. This is why the Sherman matters after World War II, not because it was the best tank, but because it reveals the human cost of industrial war more honestly than almost any other machine. It shows us what happens when urgency overrides perfection, when survival depends on numbers, when men trust flawed steel because it's all they have, and it forces us to confront a final, unsettling realization. One day, long after the last Sherman has rusted away, historians will stand before the tanks of our time. Abrams, Leopards, T-90s, they will debate their strengths, their weaknesses, their kill ratios. They will restore a few, put them behind ropes, write placards, and someone will ask the same question you just asked now. What happened to it after the war? And the answer will sound familiar. It was stored. It was sold. It was upgraded. It was scrapped, it was remembered, it was forgotten. Because machines don't decide when wars end. People do, and the Sherman's scarred, outdated, stubbornly enduring stands as proof that history doesn't disappear when the shooting stops. It just goes quiet.